So welcome to another of our podcast editions on keeping the promise across Scotland. This builds on our previous podcasts of children's hearing system and doing the data differently. This podcast is around a good childhood and whole family support. Can I say a warm welcome to my lovely guests this afternoon, Leeann and Karen, and we're having a roundtable discussion on whole family support and would really like to hear more about your family wellbeing service. Before I do some introductions from yourself, my name is Alison Sutherland and I'm the new Head of Support at the Promise Scotland. Can I take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to you for your time today and really excited to hear what you've got to say. So Leeann, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi there, I'm Leeann Hart. I'm Service Manager from Children First with East Renfrewshire Family Wellbeing Service.
Karen?
Hi, yeah, I'm Karen Shields. I'm Service Manager at Intensive Services at HSCP East Renfrewshire.
Brilliant, thank you. So, as you know, whole family support, a good childhood are at the heart of the promise. So I wonder if you could tell us about what is the East Renfrewshire Family Wellbeing Service and how did it come about?
So the Family Wellbeing Service was developed in 2017. That was when we first started supporting families. However, before we got to that point, there was a long time spent thinking together, East Renfrewshire and Children First, thinking about how can we offer the best support we can to children, young people and their families where children, young people are experiencing emotional distress. At the time, East Renfrewshire were recognising, and the data was telling them, that there was lots of children and young people who were needing support around about their emotional wellbeing and mental health. And at that time, the support offer that could be given was either via GPs or CAMs, but that was not where those children and young people and their families were needing support. And the conversations were happening with East Renfrewshire and Children First together, thinking about what do we offer these children and families, what support can we offer them, and kind of working really closely together, co-production, and thinking about the best support for children and families. We came together with and kind of consulting with families. We came together to think the whole family, kind of intensive whole family support approach was the right support, and that was how the Family Wellbeing Service was born.
And I think that recognition that children don't exist in isolation, they're part of a family, and the existing services were focused on that individual approach to children, whether even, I think some of the input from schools, which all that is really valuable, but what was missing when we looked at our data and also looked at what families were telling us was that approach that included the whole family round about a child and how that would be key to making those changes, and a recognition that those were children and young people who didn't necessarily meet the tariff for a CAMS service, and potentially probably not even a targeted social work intervention. But how did we support those children, young people and their families without the need for coming to either social work or CAMS, and to give that route through the GP that was probably a bit different from other routes into services.
You mentioned data. What kind of data were you talking about there?
Well, we were looking predominantly at the number. I think, like all services, the quite often the tension points tell you where most need is, and like many other authorities, that tension about CAMS and waiting lists, and actually children on those waiting lists that don't necessarily need that level of clinical support. So that would be predominantly where our data was coming from, a bit thinking about those. And then I think even across as we've developed the services over time, what our data then increasingly told us during COVID was that those children and young people were more likely to come to the attentions of services because of their mental health. So it was quite reaffirming that this had been the route that we had gone down, and then obviously nobody had predicted a global pandemic, but actually it was reassuring then for us that we had picked the right place to target our support, because the pandemic then was telling us that actually those were the children that were coming to the forefront and looking for help and support and services. So in some ways we weren't necessarily on the back foot about that, because we had an existing service in the family wellbeing service that gave that support to the whole family, and predominantly around about mental health and well-being that didn't meet the threshold for CAMHS.
Huge area, isn't it? You've mentioned partnership working. So what kind of partners are we talking about, and how important was that to making this a success?
The partnership's been absolute key from the kind of early conversations. There was the kind of shared vision, the recognition of a kind of approach that we both felt was the right approach to take to offer support to children and families. And from that early kind of beginning of thinking about what the service might look like, right through to 6.5 years later where we're at now, the partnership's been absolutely critical in terms of everything, I suppose.
Yeah.
Like kind of making sure we're offering the right support to children and families, kind of adapting our support, but always maintaining the fundamental kind of whole family support offer that we were.
So that core offer
core,
and and building on that.
And then recognising where we needed to. So we have conversations a lot, and we've done other kind of presentations together, and the importance of the kind of honesty and difficult conversations. That's what's made this partnership really work. We've been able to be really honest with each other, Children First and the HSCP in East Hampshire, thinking together about what do we need to do now, where do we need to go, what, like the pandemic's a prime example where we've needed to really think thoughtfully about our services and about how we meet the needs of children and families.
And I think really from the very off, it's about those core shared values and about the importance of, and in a genuine way, hearing the voices of children and young people and their families. So we had started on that almost safe footing that our intention was the same and our core values were the same. So I think that's made the partnership journey really quite straightforward. And as Leeann said, we've spoken at length about when there is difficult times, because there is. And I think the quote I'd used the last time we spoke about, this isn't nirvana. We're very clear that when we're talking about it, this is not without, no partnership is without pitfalls. But I suppose what we're trying to do is model the relationship that we want to have with our children and young people, and that's partnership, transparency, and having those conversations when we need to be. So relationships, I don't think, it's hard to quantify, but I don't think we could underestimate how important it's been in the success of the work that we've done, and how the work's developed from those early thoughts and trialling out almost a pilot approach to, is this the right thing to do, to where we are 6.5 years later, and we almost have it feels like a whole childhood approach now. So we've got various interventions that we partner with Children First and other voluntary organisations, but it's about thinking about that continuum of a child's life and also about a continuum of services. Where do we dip in, where do we dip out, and who's the best place to provide that? And I think that's been key to the relationship, saying, I'm not sure if that should be us, maybe that should be you, I don't know if we can do it. So those really difficult conversations about what does the service look like, and then at tricky times, like as all local authorities, voluntary sector, all partnerships are facing really difficult financial times. How do you have those really honest conversations and keep it at the core the value that you really still want to provide that level of service that our children and young people have been able to benefit from for 6.5 years, which is hugely significant.
That is, definitely. You've mentioned the 6.5 years, which is a long time for a project, and building on the learning I'm sure you've taken from the pilot. How much has it changed over that time, and are you adapting more now to meet different needs, or are you sort of strengthening different approaches and, sort of upscaling? Could you say a wee bit more about that?
So since the beginning of the service, so I came on board at the kind of the design phase had happened. So I came on board at that time as team leader to really deliver the service and build the team. And I suppose over since then to where we are now, there's been growth, but it's been staged growth. So it started off, as Karen said, as a year's pilot.
Right.
So like a small test for change. Then we grew that a wee bit more. Just always testing out. Are we on the right track here? Are our thoughts the right thoughts? Is our approach the right approach? And constantly seeking feedback from children and families all the time and having the conversations with each other as a partnership. And I suppose one of the things when I was listening to Karen talking there, one of the things that's made our partnership really strong from our perspective, from Children First perspective, as a third sector provider, we've always felt equal at the table for the conversations. We're part of the kind of strategic conversations in East Renfrewshire where our opinion, our expertise is valued. And I think that's been really critical in making this a really good partnership. And that's not always the case for third sector partnerships. Third sector voice is not always given the place at the table, if you like. So that's been really important in our relationship and our partnership. So going back to kind of the growth of the service, we've been really robust over the 6 years, looking at the kind of impact of the support, what are we trying to achieve in terms of systems change, and how does it feel for children and families, and what's the impact for them, and being really robust around about that over time. So there's been growth. It's been really, because there's a need, and the pandemic really has made there's an acute need for support around about mental health and children's emotional well-being, and there's never been a more important time to have support services and our whole family approach to supporting emotional distress and mental health.
So you mentioned impact of the service. So what has the impact been on children, on young people, on whole systems approach? Could you say a wee bit more about that?
I think probably, again, a key to the service having such an impact is those really kind of critical but often seen as not valuable bits about us coming together as a partnership and actually looking at data regularly and sitting down round the table and having those questions of each other, curiosity about, so how many is that and what does that mean and what have those outcomes been? And I think that's for us reinforced then when we do get, and I think Leeann can speak to the figures, but the consistent improvement in reported mental health has been, I suppose, the key thing that's made us think that actually we continue to invest in this. This will still be a big part of our offer. And I think it's about evaluating that impact too, which again, I'm talking from many years of third sector experience as well. It's sometimes quite hard to articulate that, but I think what this partnership has done very well is there's been the rigour about that throughout, and those critical questions about, so what has the difference been? And that's not just about I love data, but it's not just about data, it is about then hearing those real life stories and actually what that's meant. So we can have the data that tells us that a young person is feeling better, which is great, but actually the stories about families saying, I don't know where I would have been without this service. And that voice coming that actually it's not a doctor, it's not CAMHS, it's not social work, it's somebody there that's kind of walking the walk with you. And those voices have been critical alongside the data that showed that consistent improvement in young people's mental health.
What was really important and what has been important throughout this journey as well has been, there's always been clarity about what we're trying to achieve through the service. So what are the kind of systems change and impact we're trying to make, and what benefit do we want it to be for children and families? And there's always been an understanding of where we're going with the service. There's lots of clarity about purpose, and it's really important because that then helps us be really clear about what the support is we're wanting to offer children and families, and why we're there to support children and families as well, and how we're really clear in being able to give families what they need in terms of support.
What have the barriers been? What have the challenges been? I'm sure you've encountered many, but what were they? How did you overcome that?
I think probably, and not necessarily a barrier, but I think, and like Leeann, I wasn't involved at the very initial stages of planning, but the referral route's probably quite unusual into this kind of service, that it comes from GPs.
Okay.
And Leeann can talk much more about this, but I think there had to be a real investment in that referral process. And what was the information coming, and about consent? Because in fairness to GPs, as we know, they have a very short period of time to see a young person and a family, and it's about the service getting the information that they needed to make sure that was the right information. And then over the years, how that's developed, about how we make sure as a service we've got consent for a service and that it's the right one. And there's been many iterations over the years about how we do that. So it's not necessarily been a barrier, but it's been a focus of the work to make sure that we're getting the right children and young people referred in. We've got the information that we need, and we're not increasing the delay, because at the very outset, the reason the service developed was so that children and families weren't waiting on waiting lists for other services. So that's been a critical part that's evolved over time. And actually the service has, they always amaze me, the figures about the number of families that they've managed to contact within 2 weeks. And when we compare that to other services across the board, my own included, 2 weeks is a really short time for families to get that message that at least someone has heard them and there will be help at a point. And that's been critical, I think.
Yeah, so kind of going back to the evolution of the service, one of the kind of bottom lines we put in place from the first day was that when families go to their GP, because it's pretty much all families come to us through their connection with their GP, and that we wanted to make a commitment as part of our service offer that within 2 weeks of the GP speaking to us, we would make contact with the family, and the importance of connecting with the family that quickly, to hear from them what support they feel they need, or I suppose even taking a step back from that, what help are they looking for, what's going on, what's difficult for them, why do they need help. Really just us asking some key questions to help them process, make sense of their story, and to start sharing it with us. So from that very first call, we're getting to know the family and helping them to have some space and time to share their story and to think with them about what support that they would benefit from or that they might find helpful. So what can we do to help them? And that the support beginning from that point, and we've maintained that for the whole time of the figures are in the 90%, the target's 90% of all families that come into who are connected with our service that will contact with them within 2 weeks. And the most recent annual report, it was 98% of families are connected within, and it's high numbers.
That's fantastic, yeah.
And we've managed to maintain. There's been challenges, and it was difficult during the pandemic for various reasons, but it's been something we've always aspired to. It was a bottom line that we didn't want to lose from the service. And families tell us that has been so important because of the very nature of the route into the service. Families are going to their GP seeking support. They're going when they're ready for support. They're not being band-aided from somebody else. They've not been, a referral's not been made by a service. They're seeking out support. So they go to their GP. They're in a place of, we need this. We're ready for this. Can you please help me? And what we are really quickly able to do. And it's that call is the beginning of the support. It usually takes about an hour. The worker, we've got a dedicated group of staff within our team that do that work. And then within that first call, we agree with the family what is obviously one member at that moment, but we're in the first call, we're beginning to hear about the kind of what's going on in the family, what's happening for your child, your young person, and what do you need, and hearing from the parent, because quite often it is the parent, and they're so distressed because they want their child to feel better. They want to be able to help their child. They don't understand what's going on in my family. Why is this happening? It's all different. You know, it's a different story for every family, as we'll all know that. But the importance of it is about giving them the time, the space. I've had first calls with a parent that's lasted hours, and just having to be present for them and give them that space and time. But really importantly, one, validating. Actually, most of the times it's not surprising that they're feeling like this, or all of the time, because that's their story and the impact on them. So validating that, but also pulling out, despite this, you're managing to do X, Y, or Z. Do you like the strengths? What are the strengths that this parent's had to survive this, or that their child's okay? And that, for me, is kind of fundamental parts of a whole family support approach. Is about really hearing. You're thinking always about the child and or the young person, sorry, but then you're really understanding what does it feel like to be a child in that family, and what support can we give to the family to help the child. Not, right, okay, let's take your child and we'll sort them and we'll drop them back in again. That doesn't, it might offer a brief moment of reprieve or kind of alleviating distress, but it doesn't give long-term impact and change and improvement. And what part of the data gathering that we do is looking at GP representations. Okay. So we measure that. We ask when the family first come to us, how many times in the last 6 months have you seen this child, young person in relation to their emotional well-being? And then we'll ask throughout support, but then at the ending, when we're ending with a family, we'll ask if they've been back to their GP and how many times. And then we also do follow-up 6 months after we end. And the 6 months post-ending, there's been an 86% reduction in representations at GPs. So the impact on the system is significant. And that was one of the hopes in the early stages. The hope was that it would alleviate some of the pressure on CAMHS, and we would alleviate some pressures on GPs. Mm-hmm. And it has, from the data we've been able to gather and be really rigorous about, and keep, as a partnership, we're constantly looking at it. But we've got to that because of adopting a whole family support approach, and not just tending to one part of the family. It's about thinking about the whole family, because children live and grow and exist in their relationships and their family. And if that's not paid attention to, there's not, the impact's really, it's insignificant.
Short-lived.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably another barrier, thinking about that. So what we have learned, certainly over time, is that whole family support is not about a moment in time. It is about building on those existing strengths and working with a family for as long as they need you to work with them for. And also having easy routes for families to reconnect if things get difficult, so that you don't necessarily need to start at the beginning of the process. And I think that different lens, again, even in my career, from when you had the distinct period of time to do what you were doing, there was your evidence at that time, and then really you didn't know what happened after that. And this has felt much different to that, and that evidence over time that actually it's doing exactly what the initial set-up pilot project was to do, and it was to reduce that time that families were seeking support. Because as we know, actually going to your GP can be a really difficult thing to do, and to go to a GP to say that what you're worried about is either your own or your child's mental health is a huge step for parents. So that immediacy was really important. But also that what we've not managed as a partnership is thinking about, well, how many cases have you closed and how many have you opened? And that's almost feels like language from the past for us, because this is about sustainability. This is about building in strengths over time, and what's important is the outcome rather than how long it takes. And actually that's quite a difficult position to hold, when quite often funding and financial constraints mean that things are in place for shorter periods of time. So for us, 3 years seems like a long time. Actually, in a family or several families' life, it's a snapshot. So a barrier is thinking, when you get something that works, how do we sustain this over time, and how can this be something that becomes part of our offer and not a project that lives and dies at the end of funding, because that's not what our support does.
And families need the support to continue. I suppose you were asking what are challenges and barriers for a partnership like ours, and for third sector providers it absolutely is about funding. And we've got a range of services that we deliver together in East Renfrewshire, and Children First together deliver, and there's different services have different fundings, and some are year on year, and like many other places, that's quite a lot of the time that's third sector providers are living with really short periods of time. But the impact on that is on families is significant as well, because as Karen's saying, families don't stop and start needing support. They generally need a period of support that shouldn't be dictated by what support there is. Services closing, reducing, because funding can't be provided longer term. So we've been quite fortunate in the family wellbeing service that we've been able to have longer periods of funding, but we're in a really difficult financial time at the moment for the whole sector and funding, and it'll be a real challenge going forward to think, how do we continue to deliver all our services with the current funding situation? And it's difficult for third sector providers. The impact on that on families is much more significant.
What do you think the Scottish Government could do then to enable further support?
I suppose what thinking through what we know works, because I think we're much more advanced now and thinking about knowing what works. You know, the promise tells us this is about support at the right time and for how long you need it. That's what young people and children and their families have told us. That longevity of funding, I think, is critical to planning. And it's funding is always welcome, and we can't be creative without it. But there's something about how we traditionally fund any bits of work, and that there'll be funding comes in, and 3 years is a luxury in most funding situations. The reality is you have to be absolutely on the forefront, and in 2 years down the line thinking about what happens next and what is the next stream of funding. And there's a real challenge, I think, across the sector about how do we continue to plan without knowing that the security of funding's there. So I suppose in terms of what the Scottish Government can do, it's about that sustained core funding, I think, so as that partnerships like ours can plan further down the line without interruptions about thinking about where do we get the money to keep this going? What funding stream will we look at now? And actually that takes a lot of resource, effort and planning, which is right. But I suppose if there was that security of longer term funding, there would be less demand on operational partnerships to be thinking about. Actually, we need to think about what happens March 23, what happens March 24, you know, and those year-on-year conversations. And I think that's probably something that we have managed very well over the piece, and have been very grateful for external funding to come in to really help us boost what we've been doing. But the reality is when things start to shrink, we'll have the same number of children and young people, and it's about that planning ahead. And quite often any bits of funding that come in, we hear in November, and that whether we're getting the next year. So we're still funding in a reactive way while trying to plan in a proactive way.
Has the whole family wellbeing fund helped?
Well, interestingly, that's where some of the service has moved over the years. So Leeann's service started, and then probably just before COVID in East Renfrewshire, we did a kind of large-scale co-production event with our children and young people, our partners in education, asking them actually what they needed. And again, what came out of that was a really strong message about mental health. And probably at that point, the lens was more on mental health that didn't necessarily meet the criteria for Leeann's service, so that more generic mental health and well-being. And we got round the table again and thought about what does this look like now? This feels like something else. Children, young people are telling us that there's still this need, but it's maybe a kind of lower level's not the right word, but just that general feeling that children and young people still needed more support for their mental health that wasn't targeted services. So we were able to use some of that funding to think about what we did next. And during COVID, again, this is part of the strength of the partnership. We had existing partnerships with Children First, so a lot of these conversations were much easier, and we were very quick. And we established another service, which is our Healthier Minds service, that again we're in partnership with. And that's responding to initially quite a different need. And we used, again, creatively, we used youth counselling funding, and we brought together a new partnership that included Children First, but also our colleagues in RAMH, our school nursing colleagues, education colleagues, our CAMS colleagues. And we created another service with that. We use a hub model, so as that children and young people come to the hub and then they're directed to the service that best meets their needs, whether it's youth counselling, or it could be the Children First service, or it could in fact be back to family wellbeing. So there's that crossover between the services. So we use that bit of funding and that funds part of that. So that's what I mean about we've been trying to be creative with what funds are there and use that to plan forward about what the need is. And both the services have grown exponentially since they started, and both have evidenced consistently that improvement in children and young people's mental health. And it's how do we sustain that then? And thinking about how does that become just part of our core business?
Because the kind of introduction and of the whole family wellbeing fund is great, but it's in alongside cuts in other places. So there's a conversation about what does that actually look like in reality when there's money being cut from one budget, but there's another one coming in the door. And I'm not saying this is not about East Hampshire, I just mean in general
terms,
across the board in Scotland, what's actually happening with the whole family wellbeing fund and how is it being used to deliver whole family support services across the piece.
No, that's really fascinating, and some of the impact you've described is really impressive. We've touched on some of the barriers. What else do you think needs to change to enable more partnerships like this to flourish and, to get in at that earliest point to help children, young people and families?
I think that's quite difficult, because I think as soon as you start to open the door to these partnerships, there's so many potential partnerships, and so people always have the best intentions. So it's quite difficult to think through why does that not necessarily work other places and it's worked here. I suppose we have been fortunate, and a lot of our success has relied on relationships both between organisations but also personal relationships. And I think again that's about us trying to model what we want to be for our children and families. And that's not to say that it might not work elsewhere because you can't replicate that, but it's coming back to that core value about what is important and where is the value placed. So the value always comes back to children and young people. But that can be really difficult, and it sounds like the easiest thing in the world to do. So I think a wider barrier is how do you take your eyes almost above the horizon to think, what would we want this to look like? What are our children and young people telling us? And I suppose that's another really tricky thing to do, because quite often, as they should do, our children and young people and families tell us that what we're doing isn't working. And that's a really hard message sometimes.
It is. And also dependent on the needs of individual children and young people and families. You're trying to be as bespoke and nuanced as you can, but quite simply you don't have the staffing or you don't have that resource. So it's trying to make sure that there's something for everyone.
And that, I suppose, again, turning that on its head about that not necessarily being a barrier, because the fact that a family's still alive and they're still existing means that they do have strengths. And at times they're tested. But it's flipping that, I suppose, on its side, because it traditionally we would go in and offer support. But actually, that's what we want to do, is build that longevity for a family so that they feel empowered to be able to use the resources that they have, whether it's their own resources, community resources. Children go to school, they're part of a school community, about widening out what we mean and not being precious about individual services. I think that's another key part that's been critical to the partnership, that it's not that I'm a GP and this is what I do, I work in CAMS, this is what I do. It's like, actually, what's going to work best for that young person? And those barriers coming down, which as soon as there's any threat to anybody, of course, it's a natural response, and we understand that when families do it, but we also need to understand it professionally. So it's those barriers coming down and saying, actually, working in silos doesn't work for families. We know that. They tell us that really, really clearly. So how do we sit down and go, how do we get this family support right? And I think that, for me, is the key to whole family support. It's not about services that match. We've been fortunate, but the key to that is being about what works for that family at this point in time. And us getting better as a profession, I think, and professionals to sit down and think about, how do we cut the red tape and get to a point where we can sit and say, right, actually, this looks like the best fit, this looks like the best support, and let a family then flourish. And I think that is a barrier.
And I guess having knowledge of all those different services within a local area, certainly from my experience, it is difficult to know in particular localities, what's that service, what do they do, how do I contact them? And you've got so many amazing services that you actually might not know about them. So I suppose it's that data and evidence gathering and mapping out what is where and for who, that's really important as well.
And for us, so inviting people to sit at the table, which Leeann spoke about earlier. Of course. And I think that really has been key. This is not, it's almost like, it's not a partnership for partnership's sake, it's true partnership. So come and sit at our strategic meetings, and as soon as you open the door to that, you have lots of partners then that you realise, and I think that's key.
It's that, I've already made the point, but that important bit about third sector partners being viewed as being equal in terms of what we can offer, our voice, our expertise, our knowledge, experience. And I suppose this is a good example where that has absolutely been the case. We've been respected and valued enough to be able to contribute, and over the 6+ years being part of those wider conversations about East Renfrewshire's strategy and in relation to emotional wellbeing and distress, and how we support children and families that are needing support across lots of different kind of areas of need, I suppose. We've been absolutely, I would say, an equal partner in the partnership.
So what's your next steps and your plans for the service?
Keep going.
Keep going, yeah, I suppose. I think that's probably, again, a bit like the children and families that we work with. It's walking that walk. There will be changes. It's inevitable. As our funding constraints change, but also listening to what children and families are telling us. We don't anticipate that the need's going to decrease. Overall. We're making an inroad, obviously, to evidence change for a small number of children and families. The need isn't going to go away. We're seeing increasing numbers through all our services in relation to mental health. So that's not going to go away. I suppose the challenge for us moving forward is, how do we develop that sustainability without losing the quality of what we've had already? And some really difficult conversations about that might mean it's less children. We have to target it more to ensure that we've got that longevity. And how do we get that? How do we get that right? And then I suppose thinking from a partnership lens, if that means one bit shrinks, where does everybody else go, and how do we meet that need? So I think, going back to your earlier question, Alison, about what can the Scottish Government do, that funding bit is critical, really about critical. How do we plan over time. So the need will remain. The partnership we're invested in, and the work we know is making a difference. So we need to continue to invest in it in whatever shape that we can.
And I think it's important that going forward that we hold on to what we know has worked well and what families have told us that's worked well for them in terms of what's the right support. The right support, families tell us, is for it not to be just about the child. It's about the family and helping parents to understand and make sense of what's going on for their child, and then what can they do, and then parents get support to be able to support their children. And that the parents tell us that's been really helpful, understanding what's going on for their kids, and for them how they can help improve their children's life and be there for them. And because I say to families straight away, we want to be with you we'll be with you as long as we need to, but we want to be with you as short a period of time as we can be, because we want families to go on and live good lives together without services being involved. Yeah. So I think it's really important that, you know, as we move forward, we hold on to the bits that have worked well and what families have told us that's worked well for them.
So I have no doubt on the back of listening to this podcast that people will be absolutely inspired and enthused and really, you know, hearing your passion about what you've achieved over a relatively short period of time, which is really impressive. So thank you for sharing that. What 3 pieces of advice would you give to people listening who think, we could maybe take forward a family wellbeing service in our area that will suit the needs of our families and localities? What 3 bits of advice would you give them?
I think the first bit for me would have to be ask. Ask your children, ask your young people, ask your families, and listen to what they tell you. Would probably be my first.
Me too, absolutely. First and foremost, their voice. We talk about it all the time. We talk about children and young people need to be listened to. They need to be heard. Need to be involved in decision making. Yeah, you have to do it in terms of delivering, developing services.
The second for me would probably be to not skip the step about investing in the partnership relationship. Because that has been critical not only to this service but the other services that we run together, who include other partners. So it's not missing the step about investing in that relationship and having those conversations about what are your aspirations for this service, what do you want to achieve, what will that look like, and having that clarity from starting a process about what do you want to see at the end.
And I think that given the conversation we've just had about funding, but absolutely starting from a position of seeing how much time and money can we commit to this? Are we investing for the long haul? Because we started this partnership with an intention of, okay, this is not a year's pilot. This is with the intention of, let's go forward together and make this part of our system, and let's change our system. That longer term,
isn't it? Yeah, that longer term vision.
So I think that's really, really important, and the shared vision, and we constantly think together about, are we still on the same page here? Are we still going forward in the same direction? So I think constantly keeping an eye on that as well, and reviewing that there's a kind of shared understanding.
So voice, partnership, vision.
Yes.
Excellent.
Absolutely.
Can I say a huge thanks? That has been hugely motivating, inspiring. It's an amazing piece of work, and thank you for all that you do each and every day to keep the promise.
Thank you.
Thank you.